In today's show, we remember Bill Walton, an all-time great trailblazer and one of the guiding lights of this very podcast. Welcome to Locked On Blazers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Trailblazers, your daily Portland Trailblazers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What up, world? It's your past first point guard and Trailblazers reporter, Mike Richmond. You are listening to another episode of Locked On Blazers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get podcasts and also on YouTube. Thanks for making this show your first listen, coming at you each and every weekday, Monday through Friday. So make it a part of your daily routine. Tell your friends to do the same. Make it your first listen as Locked On Blazers, your team every day. In today's show, we're going to remember one of the greats. Bill Walton passed away on Monday, May 27th at the age of 71. An all-time great Blazer, a legend in the community, a legend in the game, and a legend in the broadcast booth. A man who, in many ways, is the guiding spirit of this podcast. We are going to honor Big Red in today's show. I want to do it in a couple different ways. I want to talk about Bill Walton, the basketball player. Just an all-time great hooper, a dude who just won when he was available to play the games. He won them. That is the lasting truth of Bill Walton's career. But he was also someone who developed an ethos that was infectious and that he was eager to spread. And his off-court impact was incredibly loud. He became a larger-than-life character and someone who, depending on how old you are, you probably have enjoyed and appreciated Bill Walton for different reasons throughout the years. So we'll talk about Bill Walton, the guy, the person, the human, in the second segment. And then we'll close the show honoring Bill Walton the way I think he'd want to be honored, which is with a little bit of Blazers optimism. He was fiercely optimistic, particularly later in his life. Fiercely optimistic. We'll try to channel some of that true optimism here on the show. Let's start with Bill Walton, the player. I am not old enough to remember Bill Walton, the player. Bill Walton's NBA career ended before I was born. Some 6 months before Michael showed up, Bill Walton was done playing basketball. So what I know of Bill Walton is from watching the extremely long 30 for 30 documentary about him, from the 10 years I've spent covering the Blazers, including some time for the paper of record, in which we would write sort of deeper dives into the history and be responsible for things like writing a book about the Blazers' 40 years of Blazer history and things like that. But much of my appreciation of him is in many ways academic. Right? Like, I have seen the clips on YouTube. I have seen him cram on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in one of the great plays in Blazers history. And like, ooh, look out, Kareem, this dude's better than you. This is the highest highs, right? But it is not a deeply held, personal experience appreciation of Walton. So if you are roughly my age, even in your early 40s, you probably don't really remember Bill Walton playing for real in a meaningful way, but you may remember Bill Walton, the guy. So we'll talk about the guy in a second. The player, though, an absolute phenom on the court. He started just by winning all of his collegiate basketball games. Back in the early 70s, freshmen didn't play. So he shows up as a sophomore at UCLA, and they just keep on winning. He was a part of a UCLA team that won 88 consecutive basketball games, including his sophomore and junior season. His junior season in 1973, in the national championship game, is perhaps the greatest college basketball final ever played, perhaps the greatest college basketball game ever played, where he goes 21 of 22 and is the most dominant force on the court. He was absolutely phenomenal. He comes out, plays another season in college, and in 1974 is the number one overall pick by the Portland Trail Blazers. They spend a couple years where he is unavailable due to some injuries, and they're not good. And Walton is not yet miserable in Portland, but he is unhappy. And then they get Maurice Lucas in the dispersal draft, in the ABA draft, among with other players that they added. That kind of a big retool that summer, but importantly Maurice Lucas. And him and Bill Walton forged a friendship. If you've never read Breaks of the Game by David Halberstam, you should read it. If you have read it, you should read it again. It's great. It's the sports book I've certainly read the most of any of them. It does have a little bit of sports writer from early 1980s language in it that if you are of a certain age, particularly for my younger audience, shout out to my Gen Z listeners, you will notice it, but it's fantastic, and it's some of the stories in are just great. But Walton forged an immediate friendship with Maurice Lucas, and then they win the title as the youngest team in the league. And not only did they win the championship, not only did they win the championship, they beat the Lakers to do so. They beat Dr. J and the Sixers in the finals. They come back from a series deficit to get the win. And in Game 6, Walton is bonkers. I'm telling you, the Finals MVP of the 1977 championship. In Game 6, he has 20 points, 23 rebounds, 7 assists, and 8 blocks. He averaged 19, 5, and 4. That's 4 blocks. 20 points, 23 boards, 7 assists, and 8 blocks in a championship game. The following year, the Blazers would go 50-10 before Walton's feet basically gave out on him. And he would miss the remainder of the season, but he would win MVP. The Blazers' only player to ever win MVP. He comes back in the playoffs, plays twice against the Sonics in the opening round of the playoffs, and he's just not right. And within a year, he is suing the Trailblazers and asking for a trade. It ended quickly. It was abrupt. He ends up missing 3 of the next 4 seasons. He plays for the Clippers as they debut in San Diego and then as they move to LA. And then finally, back healthy after missing a number of games and just tons of ankle and foot surgeries to try to get his body right. He finally does and plays on one of the most talented teams in the history of the NBA, the 85-86 Celtics. He wins, he's 6th man of the year that year, plays in 80 games. They win the championship. He plays 10 more games the rest of his career. He played 10 more games in the following season. He didn't play in the 87-88 season and then announced his retirement shortly thereafter. It was abrupt, and when Walton was available, he was an all-time great. Ian Carmel, local comedian, he's from Beaverton, Oregon, top of the food chain where champions are made. He mentioned on social media today that he doesn't know if Bill Walton is the greatest Blazer of all time, but he's certainly the most Blazer of all time. And I think that is the perfect way to put it. And I will say this unequivocally. No one has gotten to the peaks that Walton has in a Blazer uniform. I think some of greatest of all time GOAT talk is your personal preference and what you value, whether you value longevity, whether you value championships, whether you value a sort of closeness to the community and all of those things. Like some of it is soft stuff, some of it is hard stuff, some of it is like, it's the hard stuff being like stats that you see in this stat sheet, and some of it is like how long did you do it, but undeniably, with all the GOAT talk, and this is not the time or the place to get into any of that. No one who has worn a Trailblazers jersey has ever been singularly as good for the peaks that Walton did. The best, for a brief period, the best basketball player in the world. If he had been able to stay healthy, we really would have tested what that looked like during a period in the NBA history in which the Blazers could have ripped off some titles. With all due respect to the Sonics and the Sonics and the Bullets, who are going to win the next 2 championships. That pre-Bird and Magic run in the late 70s, it was a chance for the Blazers to win a lot. But they couldn't. And that stuck with Bill Walton. He had guilt about getting hurt. Not only did they have beef, a lawsuit and a trade request and all of those things. Not only did they have beef with the Blazers medical staff and all these things, but like Bill Walton Bill Walton had guilt about not being available for you, for the Blazer fans of the 80s, honestly, of the early 80s, like not being there for you to cheer him on, not being there to carry on a dynasty, not being there to be one of the great teams, because he knew they were that good and that special, and he talks about it all the time. And in many ways, because he holds that team in such high reverence, so does the organization, so does the fan base, because Walton set the tone for that team was special, and it just didn't work. And we as a sort of Blazer watching public really appreciate the 77 championship team in a special way. Walton is the core of it. Maurice Lucas is pretty special too, but Walton is the core of it. His career ends quickly. Again, I didn't see him play. I know most of my exposure to him is academic. My exposure to Bill Walton is behind a microphone, in the broadcast booth, as one of the voices of the NBA, and then eventually one of the quirkiest and a truly unique force in the broadcast booth. Let's talk about Walton the person in the second segment, because the player is worth celebrating. The person is worth smiling about. That's what we'll do in the second segment. Let's smile and remember Bill Walton, a truly one-of-one unique force. Join me in that second segment, won't you? First, though, I want to tell you about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Look, it's the playoffs. It's the playoffs in the NBA. It's the playoffs in the NHL, and FanDuel wants to give you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because it's winner take all time. We're getting down to the true finals in both sports. So right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. You place a $5 bet on FanDuel, you get that victory, they'll give you 150 bonus bucks to play with. You can bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. That's FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. All right. Let's talk about Bill Walton, the person. Over the course of his 13 NBA seasons, Bill Walton missed, and I read this in a wonderful obit written by Jason Quick of The Athletic. Bill Walton missed 762 games and had 13 different surgeries on his feet and ankles. 39 different surgeries. 39 surgeries on his feet and ankles. 39 surgeries, missed 762 games over 13 years. He just wasn't... He had a great deal of guilt about not being available, about his body not being right. He's mentioned, I've seen him do this several times, that he's said, I peaked at 12 years old. By the time he got out of college, his body was shot, his knees were in trouble, and he just wasn't himself. And even then, for a brief period in the late 70s, he was the best basketball player on earth, or certainly the best basketball player in the NBA, with all due respect to it not being as a global game, as much of a global game at the time. But it took a while for Bill Walton to come back, right? I was here by the time he came back. I moved to Portland in the fall of 2006. I've almost been here about 20 years. Bill Walton didn't make a public appearance back at the Rose Garden, back in Portland at the arena until 2009. So like I was an adult at that point, right? Like I was Bill Walton had career ended before I was alive, and then his sort of feud and beef and kind of just ill will and bad, maybe not bad blood, but just like not ready to mend the fences with the Blazers lasted until I wasn't into my adulthood. But then in 2009 he came back, and he had kind of come out on the other side. He had already worked at NBC and done finals games. I have a very vivid memory of him calling the Nets-Lakers finals in the early 2000s, just because of the way he would say Lucius Harris. I remember that. That is a vivid part of my basketball memory. By the time he came back, though, when Walton was back here, when he was ready to be part of this community again, he loved it. He loved Portland. And Blazer fans loved him, and it was time for that embrace to be public and okay and celebrated. He never was like a true sort of team ambassador, right? Like he had called games for the Clippers and all these things, and like the sort of standing issues with the Blazers lasted a long time. But he was 2009 and then beyond, he was much more public and present and did things with the team that he wouldn't have otherwise. He wasn't like on the broadcast like Terry Porter is, but he was much more present and much more open about it, about his relationship with the team and all of those things. And he loved Portland, and he had developed this ethos by then that he was the luckiest guy on earth. If you have heard Bill Walton talk in public, you have heard him say, "I'm the luckiest guy on earth." And then he'll rip off reasons why he's lucky, because what Bill Walton developed was gratitude. He's a guy who, I think during his basketball career, things were dark, right? You miss that many, you have 39 surgeries, you miss almost, 800 games. It's like, it's a lot of time to feel like things aren't going your way and feel sorry for yourself, get down on yourself. But Bill Walton would come out on the other side, and he's the luckiest guy on earth. In fact, Walton is perhaps, as I mentioned to open the show, perhaps the guiding spirit of this podcast. If you're an everyday listener, you've heard me say this: hold on to your joy. And the reason that I say hold on to your joy is not because I am this fierce optimist that believes everything is good. In fact, it is the exact reverse. I am someone who believes things are bad. Life has a lot of fleeting joy in it. Basketball has a lot of fleeting joy in it. So the ability to sit with something and appreciate the good things and say, this is good, I'm going to hold on to it, is a skill that you cultivate. And by the time Bill Walton was, a decade into the 21st century, he had cultivated that skill better than anyone you've ever known. He was pure joy. And that's when he kind of grew from being a fairly normal, albeit somewhat quirky announcer in the early 2000s, calling Nets Lakers in the finals, to being like an itinerant philosopher who just went on whatever tangent he wanted to, hijacked Pac-12 basketball games, and took listeners and viewers on a true journey on the broadcast. It maybe wasn't going to be much about basketball, but boy, was it going to be a lot about grizzly bears, migration routes of large birds, which way water flows, at what side of the continental divide you're on, and anything you'd ever want he'd want to talk about. He would take you on that journey. There is nobody like him. There is nobody like him. And that's what I said for I think for the older listeners, and I hear from some of them from time to time who email me, who say like, you young whippersnapper weren't young enough to appreciate him, but he was the best. And to that, I say, yeah, I have an academic understanding of how good he was. But I think people roughly my age, we kind of watched him grow from being like funny personality who clearly loves basketball to being like itinerant philosopher, right? Like truly, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm wearing the Lithuania tie-dye shirts, gift from my father. Shout out to you, Dad. Thanks for listening. I know you're not watching. But if... Walton clad in tie-dye talking about whatever he wanted. We saw him, we watched him develop into that. And if you're a little bit younger, you probably only know of Bill Walton doing things like playing drums in his basement on an alternate cast on ESPN, because the media world eventually realized that what you did with Walton was harness how unique he was. One of the interesting sort of stories about how Bill Walton became this incredibly intriguing public figure that you'd want to listen to is that he had a speech impediment until he was 28 and hated public speaking. And then kind of, as he says, learned to talk at 28 and then talked for the rest of his life as much as he could. Behind me on the YouTube screen, I think is the word I'm looking for, if you're watching, is a picture of Bill Walton in a Clippers jersey. He is holding a rose to his nose and crying. This is hold on to your joy in its purest form. I don't know if many of you know that this is sort of the guiding figure of the podcast, but Bill Walton over what is my left shoulder here, reversed on your screen, is that it is the appreciation that because things go bad more often than not, to be able to sit with the things that bring you joy and pursue them. And then if you are Bill Walton, celebrate them in as public a space as you possibly can. Ride your bike. Whenever you get a chance, tell the world how much you love your wife on national TV. Talk about whatever you want to talk about that strikes your interest, and be yourself and exude that joy as much as you can, because you came out from the other side. A dark NBA career that should have been so much more, that was taken from you because your body just wouldn't allow you to do it. And like I said, he had guilt around it. I'll share this here, although in general, I do not like when people make famous people's deaths about themselves. So I'll try to do this quickly. I was fortunate enough to interview Bill Walton one time in my life in a one-on-one setting. I talked to him maybe a handful of other times in various media capacities. But the story was, I was trying to write a story about his sort of, both him and Greg Oden were back in Portland for the same week. And I was going to try to write a story about the kindred spirits returning to Portland. And I sat with Bill Walton for 45 minutes, and he talked about everything he wanted to talk about. And when I asked him about Greg Oden, he gave me one sentence. This is someone who does things his way. And the story I wrote was not about the kindred spirits returning to Portland. It was about Bill Walton and the unique experience it is to be Bill Walton back in Portland. And I think this is maybe the way we should appreciate what Walton is, right? He is someone who exudes joy. He is uniquely himself at all times and exudes joy, and particularly later in his life. He was someone who was unapologetically himself, unique in a way that no one will ever even approach. He's one of one. There will not be ever be a Bill Walton. But what he wanted to do was talk about stuff that made him happy. He didn't want to talk about sad stuff. Not with me, not with some stranger. He didn't want to lean into it. He said, I liked Greg Oden. Everybody gets hurt. I was just first. That's the exact quote. We spent 35 minutes talking about the Multnomah Athletic Club, Wallace Park, all the bridges in Portland, and how much he revered Phil Knight, the things he wanted to talk about. And that's the spirit I want to use to close the show. Let's aggressively focus on the positives. Aggressively focus on the positive. The Portland Trail Blazers in 2024 are in a weird spot. Let's go find the positives. I got them. Come with me to the third segment to find them. Still a pass first point guard. I'm still Mike Richmond, and you are still listening to the Locked On Blazers. So, in the spirit of Bill Walton, someone who knows to hold on to his joy better than any of us possibly could. The Blazer who reached the highest peaks. This particular iteration of the Blazers is flirting with one of the worst runs this team has ever, in terms of just like lack of playoff success, playoff appearances that the franchise has ever had, right? They've been a traditionally successful franchise, sort of, they made the playoffs for 2 straight decades. And I think in general, if you are a longtime listener, shout out to my everydayers, or just if you're a someday listener, you know that I am in general I can tend towards pessimism, right? That's kind of my natural space. That's where I live. So to be fiercely optimistic, to be as rosy as maybe some would prefer is me either playing a character or getting outside my comfort zone. So what I don't want to do here is sell this as anything other than it is. In honor of Big Red, in honor of Bill Walton, in honor of the guy who was telling us, throw it down, big fella, so many times on the broadcast, I want to offer you some legitimate optimism for the Blazers, or why you, a Trailblazers fan, have a reason to hold on to your joy. I think there's a couple here that I think are honest, even if I am doing this, even if I'm wearing a tie-dye shirt and playing a character. Number one is that it's basically tabula rasa, right? It's basically a clean slate roster. Certainly they have long-term money tied up to some players and a bunch of players under contract for next season. But in terms of where they are now and where they're going to be when they're good again, I mean, the chances that they have even half the roster are incredibly slim. This is a chance over the next, I would say, season and a half, over the next 20 months, to completely remake this thing. There is nothing that is set in stone, which means that every person on the team, maybe not every, but a large chunk of the team has a chance to be part of what is next in terms of getting in from the ground up. This is a chance, if you're a Blazer fan, to appreciate something that is like truly a lump of clay roster that they can shape into something fierce that they want it to be. Sharp edges and details and all of those things that come with it as you add texture to the clay. But I think the reason for optimism is because right now, today, you are listening to Tuesday, May 28th show. This is truly a clean slate. I think lump of clay and clean slate is maybe mixing metaphors in a way that I didn't intend, or mixing art metaphors in a way I didn't intend, but hey, that's where we are. Don't record at night. I think there is optimism, or at least reason for joy, in knowing that you are watching something in its earliest stages be born, be built, and grow. This is something that's going to be nurtured and watered and maybe repotted a couple times and then thrive in the windowsill if you're an indoor plant person, or take over your entire back garden if you're an outdoor person. I think there's reason to be joyful about that. The reason to be joyful about, I think one of the most rewarding experiences as a fan, period, is watching a team grow up. There is always something fun about watching your team win, but there is nothing that is more fun about watching a team that used to not be good grow together, build together, become something, take a lump take a loss somewhere here, take a second loss somewhere here, and then overcome those things over the duration and growth together. There is nothing more rewarding than watching a team grow up. If you are holding on to your joy, know that the path forward from a very young team to a team that is eventually competitive, there is nothing more fun than watching that group grow together. Whether this group looks exactly like that or if it looks nothing like it does now remains to be seen. But the reason to hold on to your joy is because you, dear listener, are listening to a Trailblazers podcast in the middle of May, a month before the NBA draft, following one of the worst seasons in NBA history, and you are looking for a reason to be optimistic. And the reason to be optimistic is because you care about this thing, and caring about something and allowing yourself to care about something is a risk that you take every day, and that being rewarded when you do care about something is one of the great feelings in your life. There are very few rewarding things than saying, this is something that gets deep into my bones, and now the thing that is deep into my bones is doing the thing that I always dreamed it would. I'm not predicting the Blazers to hoist trophies, but I do think there is a path back to being competitive, fun, and entertaining. We are both way far away and relatively close to the last time the Blazers were in the Western Conference Finals, and I will tell you that spring in 2019 was the best buzz the Blazers had ever given the city. It was palpable here, and to watch this group, this core, get back to that, whenever that is deeply rewarding as a fan. I think the last reason for Blazers optimism, and I think this is truly in the spirit of Bill Walton, is that choosing the other side sucks. I truly believe that. I think there are a lot of different ways to be a fan, and I doing this every day for 10 months out of the year, 250 times a year or whatever it is. Doing this as often as I do, I get exposure to all different types of fans, right? But I mean this in the spirit of Bill Walton. Choosing to be hopeful, whatever hope looks like to you, is more fun than choosing doom. As friend of the podcast, JR, the great PDX Brochelite, would say, being a soggy-socked fan just leaves you with soggy socks. being hopeful and choosing to be hopeful about this team at this stage takes guts. You know who had guts to be overwhelmingly positive in the face of all of the things that challenged him? Bill Walton. Bill Walton was on TV in January. We didn't know that he was sick. I didn't know that he was dealing with a long, drawn-out battle with cancer. What I knew about Bill Walton was that he was immensely joyful every time he touched a microphone because he chose that path. So here's the challenge for you, dear listener. If you've made it here a half hour into this particular podcast, choose a little bit of joy. Choose a little bit of joy. Whatever that looks like to you, choose a little bit of joy today. Choose it in relation to the Blazers. Choose it in relation to your life. Choose it in whatever it is. Choose joy. Because Bill Walton kept choosing joy, and that's why you loved him. He loved this city. He loved this franchise. He loved this region. And he preached the good word on it every time he could. He chose optimism. Give yourself a little bit of Bill Walton. Choose optimism. Then come back for tomorrow's show. I appreciate you listening. I'll talk to you soon.